Ruby McKinley's hands trembled as she plunged them into the basin of cold water, wincing as the liquid touched her raw, cracked skin. The year was 1875, and Fort Yuma, California, was as unforgiving as the desert that surrounded it. She had spent the past 12 hours on her knees, scrubbing the wooden floors of Madame Holloway's boarding house until the pine gleamed like honey in the lamplight. The water in the basin turned pink with traces of blood from her broken skin. Ruby was 22 years old, but her reflection in the rippling water showed a face that had aged beyond its years. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her once vibrant auburn hair hung limp around her hollow cheeks. 3 years of working as a maid at the boarding house had worn her down to almost nothing. "McKinley!" Madame Holloway's shrill voice pierced through the thin walls. "Those stairs won't scrub themselves. I expect them spotless before sundown." Ruby closed her eyes, fighting back tears of exhaustion. "Yes, madam," she called back, her voice barely above a whisper. She had come west after her parents died of influenza back in Boston, following the promise of opportunity and a new beginning. Instead, she found herself trapped in what amounted to indentured servitude, working for room and board and mere pennies that she carefully saved in a tin beneath her cot. As Ruby made her way to the front staircase, bucket and brush in hand, the front door of the boarding house swung open. A tall figure blocked the afternoon sun, casting a long shadow across the freshly cleaned floor. Ruby squinted, trying to make out the features of the man who stood in the doorway. He stepped inside, removing his hat to reveal sandy brown hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but of good quality: a dark blue shirt, leather vest, and denim trousers tucked into well-worn boots. A silver star pinned to his vest caught the light. "Afternoon, madam," he said, nodding to Madame Holloway, who had emerged from her office at the sound of the door. "Sheriff Kyle Jackson, I'm looking for a room." Madame Holloway's demeanor instantly transformed from sour to sickeningly sweet. "Why, Sheriff Jackson? What an honor to have you stay with us. I have our finest room available, recently vacated by a cattle baron from Texas." Ruby pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible as she always did when guests arrived. But something about the sheriff's presence made her heart beat faster. Perhaps it was the quiet authority he carried, or the kindness in his eyes when they briefly met hers. "That sounds fine," Sheriff Jackson replied, his gaze lingering on Ruby for a moment before turning back to Madame Holloway. "I expect to be in town for at least a month. The territorial governor has asked me to help sort out some trouble with cattle rustlers in these parts." Of course," Madame Holloway simpered. "Ruby, take the sheriff's bags to room 4 and be quick about it." Ruby stepped forward, reaching for the sheriff's saddlebags, but he held up a hand. "I can manage my own bags, madam," he said firmly. Then, more softly to Ruby, "You look like you've had a long day already." The unexpected kindness brought heat to Ruby's cheeks. She ducked her head, murmuring, "Thank you, sir," before returning to her scrub brush and bucket. As she worked on the stairs, she could feel the sheriff's eyes on her from time to time. Unlike the leering looks she sometimes received from male boarders, his gaze held something else: concern, perhaps, or curiosity. Ruby kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand, but she couldn't help wondering about the man who had shown her the first bit of kindness she'd experienced in months. That night, as Ruby lay on her small cot in the cramped room under the eaves, she heard raised voices from downstairs. Curious, she crept to her door and opened it a crack, listening. "The girl is my employee, and I'll work her as I see fit." Madame Holloway's voice was strident. "I took her in when she had nowhere else to go. "What you're doing borders on slavery," came Sheriff Jackson's calm but firm reply. "I've been watching how you treat her. Those hands of hers are raw to the bone. When was the last time she had a day of rest?" Ruby's heart hammered in her chest. No one had ever spoken up for her before. "I pay her fair wages," Madam Holloway protested. "You now." The sheriff's voice held a dangerous edge. "I'd be interested to see your accounting books." There was a long silence. Then Madam Holloway spoke again, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Perhaps we could come to some arrangement, Sheriff. A man in your position must get lonely." "Madam, I suggest you stop right there," he interrupted coldly. "I'm not interested in any arrangements. What I am interested in is justice for that young woman." Ruby pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. No one had ever called her a young woman before. It was always girl or maid or simply you. "What do you want?" Madam Holloway asked, defeated. "I want to offer her a job, a proper job with fair wages and decent treatment." "Doing what exactly?" Madam Holloway's voice had turned suspicious. "I need someone to manage my new property. I've purchased the old Peterson ranch outside of town. It needs a lot of work, and I can't be there all the time with my duties as sheriff." Ruby could hardly believe what she was hearing. Was this man, this stranger, offering her a way out? "Fine," Madam Holloway snapped. "Take her. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway, but she owes me for room and board." "How much?" There was a pause, and Ruby could almost see Madam Holloway's scheming face as she calculated how much she could extort. $20. The sheriff laughed, a short, harsh sound. $5, and that's generous considering the conditions you've kept her in." 15. 7. "And that's my final offer." Another silence, then. "Fine. $7. She can leave in the morning." Ruby backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Freedom beckoned, but with it came uncertainty. Who was this Sheriff Jackson really? What would he expect from her? Was she trading one form of servitude for another? But as she looked down at her hands, cracked and bleeding from years of harsh soap and harder work, she knew she had to take the chance. Whatever awaited her at the Peterson ranch, it couldn't be worse than this. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a typical scorching day in Fort Yuma. Ruby had few possessions to pack: 2 faded dresses, a worn shawl, her mother's hairbrush, and the small tin containing her savings. She counted the coins carefully. $3.42. Not even enough to pay Madam Holloway what the sheriff had agreed to. She was tying her bundle with a piece of string when there was a knock at her door. Heart racing, she opened it to find Sheriff Jackson standing there, his tall frame filling the doorway. "Miss McKinley," he said, removing his hat. "I hope you're ready to leave this place behind." Up close, Ruby could see the sheriff was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so. His eyes were a clear blue that reminded her of the summer skies back east, and there was a small scar above his right eyebrow. I don't have enough money to pay Madam Holloway what I owe," Ruby admitted, clutching her small bundle. "She'll never let me leave." Sheriff Jackson smiled, a warm expression that transformed his serious face. "That's all taken care of. I settled your debt this morning." He hesitated, then added, "I want to be clear about something, Miss McKinley. I'm offering you a job, nothing more. You'll have your own cabin on the property, fair wages, and regular days off. If at any time you're unhappy with the arrangement, you're free to leave." Relief washed over Ruby like a cool breeze. "Thank you, Sheriff. I don't know what to say." "Kyle," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be working together, you might as well use my first name." "Kyle," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "I'm Ruby." He nodded, then gestured to her bundle. "Is that everything?" Ruby looked around the tiny room that had been her prison for 3 years. "Yes," she said simply. That's everything. They descended the stairs together, Ruby's heart in her throat as they passed Madame Holloway's office. The woman emerged, her face sour with disapproval. "So you're off then," she said to Ruby. "Don't think you'll find better elsewhere. You're nothing but a servant girl, and that's all you'll ever be." Before Ruby could respond, Kyle stepped forward. "Miss McKinley is now my business partner, Madame Holloway. I suggest you show her the respect she deserves." Partner. The word hung in the air like a promise. Ruby straightened her shoulders, meeting Madame Holloway's gaze for the first time in years. "Goodbye, madam," she said quietly, then followed Kyle out into the bright California sunshine. A horse and wagon waited outside, the wagon loaded with supplies. Kyle helped Ruby up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her. With a click of his tongue and a gentle flick of the reins, they were off, the boarding house growing smaller behind them. "Partner," Ruby asked after they had traveled in silence for a while, "is that really what you meant?" Kyle kept his eyes on the road, but a small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "I meant what I said. The ranch needs a lot of work, and I need someone I can trust to help run it. I've been watching you these past few days. You work hard, you're careful, and you don't complain. Those are rare qualities." "But I don't know anything about ranching," Ruby protested. "Can you keep accounts, read and write, make decisions?" "Yes, I can do all those things. My father was a school teacher before he died." "Then you already know more than most ranch hands. The rest you can learn." Kyle glanced at her, his expression serious. "I'm offering you a fresh start, Ruby. A chance to be something more than a servant girl. Will you take it?" Ruby looked ahead at the dusty trail that led away from Fort Yuma toward the mountains in the distance. Behind them lay years of drudgery and despair. Ahead, who knew? But for the first time in a long time, hope fluttered in her chest like a bird testing its wings. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'll take it." The Peterson Ranch lay about 5 miles outside of Fort Yuma, nestled in a small valley with mountains rising behind it and a creek running along one side. As they approached, Ruby could see a main house, weathered but sturdy looking, and several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. Fields stretched beyond, lying fallow and overgrown. "It's not much to look at now," Kyle admitted as they drove through the broken gate. "Old man Peterson let it go to ruin before he died, but the bones are good and the water rights are secure." "It's beautiful," Ruby breathed, taking in the sweep of land and sky. After years confined to the boarding house, the open space felt like freedom itself. Kyle smiled at her enthusiasm. "That small cabin over there will be yours," he said, pointing to a structure near the creek. "It needs some fixing up, but it's solid. The main house is larger than I need, but I figured it would serve as both home and office." He pulled the wagon up in front of the main house and helped Ruby down. "Let me show you around, and then we can figure out where to start." The tour revealed both challenges and possibilities. The main house had 4 rooms, a large front room that could serve as both parlor and office, a kitchen with a good stove but missing some windows, and 2 bedrooms in the back. Everything was dusty and neglected, but structurally sound. Ruby's cabin was smaller but charming, with 1 main room and a tiny bedroom. It had its own small stove and a pump that brought water right inside, a luxury Ruby hadn't expected. "This is more than I've had in years," she said, turning to Kyle with shining eyes. "Thank you." He looked away, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude. "It's just good business. Now I need to get back to town for my duties, but I'll be back tomorrow with more supplies. In the meantime, here's some food to tide you over and some cleaning supplies to get started." He handed her a basket from the wagon. "Oh, and this is yours too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch that clinked as he handed it to Ruby. She opened it to find 10 silver dollars more money than she had held at once in years. "An advance on your wages," Kyle explained. "We'll settle on a fair monthly salary once we see how things are running, but I thought you might need some money right away." Ruby clutched the pouch, overcome with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You can thank me by turning this place around," Kyle said with a smile. "I believe you can do it, Ruby. I'll check in when I can, but for the most part, I'm trusting you to make the decisions that need making." After Kyle left, promising to return the next day, Ruby stood in the center of her cabin, hardly able to believe the turn her life had taken. From scrubbing floors on her hands and knees to managing a ranch all in the space of a day. She set to work immediately, cleaning her cabin until it shone, then turning her attention to the main house. As she worked, she made mental lists of what was needed: curtains for the windows, dishes for the kitchen, seeds for a kitchen garden. For the first time in years, she was planning for a future instead of merely surviving the present. By sunset, exhausted but exhilarated, she sat on the small porch of her cabin, watching as the sky turned from blue to gold to deep purple. The air smelled of sage and earth, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "I'm home," Ruby whispered to herself, and for the first time since her parents died, she believed it might be true. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Kyle returned the following day with a wagon load of supplies: tools, seeds, fabric, dishes, and even a few books. He stayed only long enough to help Ruby unload, explaining that a gang of cattle rustlers was keeping him busy in town. "I trust your judgment," he told her before he left. "Do what needs doing and keep track of what you spend. We'll sort out the accounts when things settle down." Left to her own devices, Ruby threw herself into the work with a passion that surprised even her. She planted a vegetable garden behind her cabin and started clearing the overgrown fields around the house. She mended fences, repaired windows, and scrubbed every surface until the neglect of years was erased. Each night she kept careful accounts in a ledger Kyle had provided, noting every penny spent and every improvement made. She hired day laborers from town when needed: 2 Mexican brothers who knew carpentry, an old cowhand who could repair almost anything, and a young boy who was willing to do the heaviest work for a fair wage and a hot meal. Kyle's visits were irregular, but always welcome. He would appear dusty from the trail, his face tired but his eyes lighting up when he saw the progress Ruby had made. Sometimes he stayed only long enough to check on things and deliver supplies. Other times he would spend a day or two, working alongside Ruby and her small crew. They fell into an easy rhythm during these visits, sharing meals and talking late into the evening. Ruby learned that Kyle had grown up in Missouri, the son of a judge who expected him to follow in his footsteps. Instead, he had headed west after the war, working as a lawman in various frontier towns before settling in Fort Yuma. "Why buy a ranch if you're committed to being sheriff?" Ruby asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset. Kyle was quiet for a moment, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. "I guess I'm looking ahead," he finally said. "Being a lawman is a young man's game. Sooner or later you get too slow or too careless and then you're dead. I wanted something that would last." He lit the cigarette, the match briefly illuminating his face in the gathering darkness. "What about you? What did you want before life took a hand?" Ruby hugged her knees to her chest, thinking. "I wanted to teach like my father, but mostly I just wanted a place to belong." She looked out over the land they had begun to transform. "I think I might have found it." Their eyes met in the twilight, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Then Kyle cleared his throat and stood up. "Better turn in," he said gruffly. Early start tomorrow if we want to finish mending that north pasture fence. As spring turned to summer, the ranch began to take shape. The main house was now fully repaired, with curtains at the windows and a proper kitchen garden out back. Ruby had planted vegetable plots that were thriving in the California sun, and the first field had been cleared and planted with alfalfa for future livestock. Kyle had purchased a small herd of cattle, 20 head to start, and hired 2 permanent ranch hands to help care for them. Ruby found herself in the unexpected position of giving orders to cowboys twice her age, but she handled it with a quiet authority that earned their respect. One hot afternoon in July, Ruby was in the main house, working on the monthly accounts, when she heard horses approaching. Expecting it to be Kyle, who was due back from town, she went to the door with a smile that quickly faded when she saw the riders, 3 men, rough-looking and trail-worn, dismounted in front of the house. The leader, a tall man with a shock of red hair and a scar across one cheek, approached the porch where Ruby stood. "This the Jackson place?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "It is," Ruby replied cautiously. "I'm Ruby McKinley, Mr. Jackson's partner. He's not here at the moment." The man looked her up and down, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Partner, huh? That what they're calling it these days?" Heat flooded Ruby's face, but she stood her ground. "Business partner," she said firmly. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Vance, Ned Vance?" He gestured to the men behind him. "Me and my boys are looking for work. Heard Jackson was hiring." Ruby studied the men, noticing the way their hands stayed close to their guns and how their eyes darted around, assessing the property. Something didn't feel right. "I'm afraid we're fully staffed at the moment," she said coolly. "But if you leave your names, I can let Mr. Jackson know you inquired." Vance's smile disappeared. "Now that's not very hospitable, madam. We've come a long way and we're mighty thirsty." He took a step toward the porch. "Maybe we could come in and discuss it." Ruby's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. As I said, Mr. Jackson isn't here, and I don't make hiring decisions without him." It was a lie. Kyle had given her full authority to run the ranch as she saw fit, but something told her these men were trouble. Vance took another step, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "I don't think you understand the situation, lady. We're not asking." The sound of a rifle being cocked broke the tension. "Step away from the lady, Vance." Kyle's voice came from the side of the house, where he stood with a Winchester raised and aimed at Vance's chest. One of the ranch hands, Miguel, was beside him with a shotgun. Vance froze, then slowly raised his hands. "No need for that, Sheriff. We were just having a friendly conversation." "Didn't look friendly from where I'm standing," Kyle replied coldly. "Now you and your boys get back on your horses and ride out. If I see you on my property again, I won't be so polite." Vance's face darkened with anger, but he backed away. "This isn't over, Jackson," he spat. "You can't watch her all the time." "That's where you're wrong," Kyle said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now go." The 3 men mounted up and rode off, dust billowing behind them. Only when they were out of sight did Kyle lower the rifle and turn to Ruby. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern etching his features. Ruby nodded, though her hands were shaking. "Who were they?" "Trouble," Kyle said grimly. "Ned Vance is one of the rustlers I've been tracking. I nearly caught him last week, but he slipped away." He looked in the direction the men had gone. "I'm sorry, Ruby. I never meant to bring danger to your doorstep." "Our doorstep," she corrected him. "This is your home, too." Something flickered in Kyle's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. "I'll stay close for a while," he said, "until I'm sure they won't be back." That night, Ruby found it hard to sleep. The encounter with Vance had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Around midnight, she gave up trying and wrapped a shawl around her nightdress, stepping outside for some fresh air, To her surprise, Kyle was sitting on her small porch, rifle across his knees, staring out into the darkness. "You should be asleep," he said without turning around. "So should you," Ruby replied, sitting beside him. "You don't have to guard me, you know," Kyle sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I brought this on you if anything happened to you because of me." He trailed off, his jaw tight. "Nothing's going to happen to me," Ruby said softly. "I survived Madame Holloway, didn't I? A few rustlers don't scare me." That drew a reluctant smile from him. "You're a brave woman, Ruby McKinley." "Not brave," she corrected. "Just stubborn, and I'm not giving up what we've built here." The word "we" hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Ruby was suddenly aware of how close they were sitting and how the moonlight silvered Kyle's profile. "You should go back inside," he said after a moment, his voice rough. "It's not proper, you being out here like this." Ruby smiled at his concern for propriety. "There's no one to see but the coyotes, Kyle, and I trust you more than any man I've ever known." He turned to look at her then, his eyes dark and unreadable in the moonlight. For a breathless moment, Ruby thought he might reach for her, but instead he stood abruptly. "Get some rest, Ruby," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll keep watch a while longer." She nodded, disappointed but not surprised. Kyle Jackson was an honorable man, and she was, after all, his employee partner or not. She rose and went back inside, but sleep remained elusive as she thought about the man sitting guard outside her door. The next day, Kyle rode into town to report the encounter with Vance to his deputy. Before he left, he insisted that Miguel stay close to the house and that Ruby keep a loaded shotgun within reach. "I don't like leaving you," he admitted as he mounted his horse, "but I need to alert the other ranchers in the area. Vance and his gang won't stop at cattle rustling if they think they can get away with more." "We'll be fine," Ruby assured him. "Miguel knows what he's doing, and so do I." Kyle nodded, his expression serious. "I'll be back before nightfall. Don't take any chances, Ruby." The day passed quietly. Ruby worked on the accounts, then helped Miguel repair a section of corral fence that had been damaged in a recent windstorm. By late afternoon, clouds were building in the west, promising a rare summer thunderstorm. "I'll check on the cattle," Miguel said, eyeing the darkening sky. "They get nervous in storms," Ruby nodded. "Be careful. I'll finish up here." As Miguel rode off toward the pasture, Ruby gathered the tools and headed back to the house. The wind was picking up, bringing with it the smell of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. She hurried her steps, anxious to be inside before the storm broke. She was almost to the porch when she heard a horse approaching not from the direction of town, but from the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property. Turning, she saw a lone rider emerging from the trees. Even at a distance, she recognized the shock of red hair, Ned Vance. Ruby's heart hammered in her chest. The shotgun Kyle had insisted she keep close was inside the house. Miguel was out of earshot, and Kyle himself was still in town. For a moment she considered running, but pride and anger kept her rooted to the spot. This was her home, and she wouldn't be chased from it. Vance reined in his horse about 20 feet away, a wolfish smile spreading across his face. "Afternoon, Miss McKinley. Sheriff not around today." "Mr. Vance," Ruby acknowledged coldly. "You're trespassing. I suggest you leave immediately." Vance chuckled, dismounting with leisurely grace. "Now that's not very hospitable, especially when I've come with a business proposition." "We have no business to discuss," Ruby replied, taking a step backward toward the porch. If she could just get inside to the shotgun. "Oh, I think we do," Vance's voice hardened. "You see, Jackson's been making life difficult for me and my associates. I figure it's time he learned what it feels like to lose something valuable." His eyes raked over Ruby in a way that made her skin crawl. Kyle will kill you if you touch me, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Maybe, Vance agreed, but he'll have to find me first. He took a step toward her, hand moving to his gun. The crack of a rifle shot froze them both. A plume of dust rose from the ground inches from Vance's boot. The next one goes through your heart, Kyle's voice rang out. Ruby whirled to see him standing at the corner of the house, rifle raised. His face was set in lines of fury she had never seen before. Vance raised his hand slowly, but the smirk never left his face. Fancy shooting, Sheriff, but you can't watch her forever. I don't need forever, Kyle replied coldly. Just long enough to see you hang. He moved forward, keeping the rifle trained on Vance. Ruby, go inside and bring me some rope. Ruby hurried to obey, returning moments later with a length of sturdy rope. Kyle had forced Vance to his knees, the rifle unwavering. Tie his hands, Kyle instructed. Behind his back, nice and tight. Ruby approached cautiously, the rope in her trembling hands. As she knelt behind Vance to bind his wrists, he suddenly lunged sideways, knocking her to the ground. In the same motion, he drew a small pistol from his boot and fired wildly in Kyle's direction. Kyle dove for cover, returning fire as Vance scrambled toward his horse. Ruby, winded but unhurt, could only watch as the two men exchanged shots. Then a cry of pain cut through the air. Kyle staggered, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Vance, seeing his opportunity, leapt onto his horse and galloped away. Kyle, Ruby ran to him as he sank to one knee, his face pale with pain and anger. Oh God, you're hit. It's not bad, he grunted, though the growing bloodstain on his shirt suggested otherwise. Help me inside. We need to stop the bleeding. Ruby supported him as they made their way to the house, fear clutching at her heart. The bullet had gone through his left shoulder, missing any vital organs but leaving an ugly wound that bled profusely. With hands that shook only slightly, Ruby cut away his shirt, cleaned the wound with whiskey that made Kyle hiss in pain, and bandaged it as best she could. We need to get you to a doctor, she said, wiping blood from her hands. Kyle shook his head. No time. Vance will be back, and he won't be alone. He tried to stand but swayed dangerously. We need to be ready. You're in no condition to fight, Ruby protested, easing him back onto the chair. Miguel will be back soon. We'll send him for help. As if on cue, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Ruby peered out the window, praying it was Miguel returning, but her heart sank when she saw 3 riders, Vance and his men. They're here, she said quietly, turning back to Kyle. His face was grim but determined as he reached for his gun belt. Get the shotgun, he instructed. And the box of shells from my saddlebag. If they want to fight, we'll give them one. Ruby hesitated. Kyle, you can barely stand. Then I'll sit, he said with grim humor. But I can still shoot. Now go get that shotgun. Outside, Vance's voice called out. Jackson, I know you're hit. Why not make it easy on yourself and the lady? Send her out and maybe I'll let you live. Kyle's eyes met Ruby's, hard with determination. Not a chance in hell, he muttered, then raised his voice. Vance, there's still time for you to ride away. Next time I won't aim for your shoulder. Laughter greeted his words. Bold talk from a bleeding man, Vance called back. We've got you outnumbered and outgunned. You've got 1 minute to send the woman out or we're coming and shooting. Ruby's mind raced. Kyle was in no condition to fight, and even with the shotgun, she doubted she could hold off 3 armed men for long. They needed help, but there was no way to summon it. Then she remembered the signal fire they had planned for emergencies, a stack of pitch-soaked wood behind the barn that would send a column of black smoke high into the air, visible for miles. If Miguel saw it, he would know to bring help. Kyle, she whispered, I have an idea. Quickly, she explained her plan. Kyle nodded, his face taut with pain but his eyes clear. It's risky, but it might work. Be careful, Ruby. I will. On impulse, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a brief, fierce kiss that surprised them both. For luck, she murmured, then slipped toward the back door before he could respond. Outside, the storm clouds had continued to gather, casting an eerie twilight over the land. Ruby crept along the side of the house, keeping low and out of sight of Vance and his men, who were positioned at the front. She had almost reached the corner when a voice said, "Well, look what we have here." One of Vance's men stood blocking her path, a nasty grin spreading across his face. Before Ruby could react, he lunged forward, grabbing her arm in a painful grip. "Ned," he called out, "look what I caught trying to sneak away." Vance appeared around the corner of the house, his face lighting up with malicious glee when he saw Ruby. "Well, well. The little lady decided to join us after all," he gestured to the house. "Jackson, I've got your woman. Come out now or she dies." Inside the house, Kyle's voice rang out, tight with barely controlled fury. "If you harm her, Vance, I swear I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." Vance laughed. "Noble sentiment, Sheriff, but you're in no position to make threats." He pressed his gun to Ruby's temple. "One last chance. Come out unarmed or I put a bullet in her pretty head." Ruby's eyes darted around, desperate for any chance of escape. The man holding her was gripping her right arm, but her left was free. And in the waistband of Vance's pants, partially covered by his jacket, she could see a second pistol. In that moment, a plan formed in her mind, dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but their only hope. She let her body sag as if overcome by fear, forcing her captor to adjust his grip. "Please," she whimpered, letting tears fill her eyes. "Please don't hurt me." The man's grip loosened slightly as he exchanged an amused glance with Vance. It was all the opening Ruby needed. With a strength born of desperation, she drove her elbow into her captor's stomach. As he doubled over, she wrenched free, lunging toward Vance and grabbing the second pistol from his waistband. Vance reacted with lightning speed, his gun swinging toward her, but Ruby was faster. The gun in her hand roared, and Vance staggered backward, a look of surprise crossing his face as red bloomed on his shirt front. Almost simultaneously, shots rang out from the house, Kyle firing through the window with his good arm. The third outlaw, who had been watching from horseback, toppled from his saddle. The man Ruby had elbowed recovered enough to draw his gun, but before he could fire, another shot cracked across the yard, dropping him where he stood. Ruby whirled to see Miguel riding in hard, rifle still smoking. For a moment, silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the labored breathing of Vance, who had fallen to his knees, clutching his chest. Ruby kept the pistol trained on him, her hand surprisingly steady. "You shot me," Vance gasped, disbelief in his eyes. "You threatened my home," Ruby replied coldly. "And the man I love." The words slipped out before she could stop them, but she knew as she spoke them that they were true. Somewhere between scrubbing floors and building a ranch together, she had fallen in love with Kyle Jackson. The front door of the house banged open, and Kyle staggered out, his face pale but his gun steady in his hand. He took in the scene with a glance the downed outlaws, Miguel riding up, and Ruby standing over Vance with a smoking pistol. "Ruby," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, suddenly feeling the reaction setting in as her knees began to tremble. "No, but you need a doctor." Miguel dismounted, taking charge of the wounded Vance while Kyle made his way to Ruby's side. Despite his injury, he pulled her into a one-armed embrace, holding her tightly against him. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair, "when I heard him say he had you." Ruby pulled back enough to look up at him. "You'll never lose me," she said softly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Something flickered in Kyle's eyes, hope, perhaps, or a reflection of what she felt. But before he could respond, he swayed dangerously, his face going even paler. "Kyle," Ruby caught him as he started to collapse. "Miguel, help me get him inside. He's lost too much blood." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Miguel rode for the doctor while Ruby tended to Kyle, who drifted in and out of consciousness, his forehead burning with fever. She bathed his face with cool water, changed his blood-soaked bandages, and whispered prayers over him as the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, rain lashing against the windows. The doctor arrived just before midnight, soaked to the skin but carrying his medical bag. He examined Kyle's wound, extracted the bullet that had lodged in the muscle after passing through, and stitched the entry and exit wounds. "He's strong," the doctor told Ruby as he packed up his instruments. "And the bullet missed anything vital. With proper care and no infection, he should recover fully." Ruby nodded, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "Thank you, doctor. You did well with the initial treatment," the doctor added, studying her with newfound respect. "Have you had medical training?" "No," Ruby admitted. "Just common sense and motivation," the doctor smiled knowingly. "The best kind of nursing is often done by those who have the most to lose if the patient doesn't recover." He patted her shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on him. In the meantime, keep him cool and try to get some rest yourself." After the doctor left, Ruby settled into a chair beside Kyle's bed, determined to watch over him through the night. Miguel had taken Vance and the surviving outlaw to the jail in Fort Yuma, returning with news that the third man had died of his wounds. "The deputy says the sheriff is a hero," Miguel reported. "These men were wanted in 3 territories." Ruby smiled tiredly. "He is a hero. But right now, he's a wounded one who needs rest." As the night deepened, the storm passed, and a profound quiet settled over the ranch. Ruby dozed in her chair, waking at every sound or movement from Kyle. Around dawn, she was startled fully awake by the touch of a hand on hers. Kyle was looking up at her, his eyes clear of fever for the first time in hours. "Ruby," he whispered hoarsely, "you're still here." "Of course I'm still here," she replied, blinking back tears of relief. "Where else would I be?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "You could be halfway to San Francisco by now after all this trouble." "This is my home," Ruby said firmly, squeezing his hand. "Our home." Kyle's expression grew serious. "I heard what you said to Vance about loving me." Heat flooded Ruby's face. She had hoped he hadn't heard that, or that he'd attribute it to the heat of the moment. I'm sorry if that makes things awkward between us." "Awkward?" Kyle tried to sit up, wincing in pain, and Ruby gently pushed him back down. "Ruby, the only thing that's been awkward is trying to hide how I feel about you for months now." Ruby's heart skipped a beat. "How? How do you feel?" Kyle reached up with his good arm, his hand cupping her cheek. "I love you, Ruby McKinley. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you on your knees scrubbing those stairs, with your hands raw and your spirit unbroken." Tears spilled down Ruby's cheeks, and she turned her face to press a kiss into his palm. "I love you too, Kyle, so much." "Then marry me," he said simply. "Be my partner in everything, not just the ranch." Joy bubbled up in Ruby's chest, so intense it almost hurt. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Kyle smiled, the most unreserved smile she had ever seen from him. "Good, now come here and kiss me properly." "I'm injured, not dead." Ruby laughed through her tears and bent to comply, her lips meeting his in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. The weeks that followed were busy ones at the Peterson Ranch, now officially renamed the Jackson Ranch. Kyle's recovery was steady but slower than he would have liked. forcing him to temporarily delegate his sheriff duties to his deputy. This left him at the ranch full-time, where he chafed at his inability to do heavy work, but found satisfaction in planning for the future with Ruby. They were married in August, a simple ceremony performed by the local preacher on the porch of their ranch house. Ruby wore a dress of pale blue silk that Kyle had ordered all the way from San Francisco, and he stood tall and proud beside her, his arm now fully healed. Miguel and the other ranch hands decorated the yard with wildflowers and Chinese lanterns, and half the town turned out to celebrate. Even Madame Holloway made an appearance, though her congratulations were stiff and her stay brief. "Never thought I'd see the day," she remarked to Ruby during the reception. "From scrubbing my floors to marrying the sheriff, you've done well for yourself." Ruby smiled politely. "I've worked hard for everything I have, Madame Holloway, including my husband's respect." The older woman's eyes narrowed at the implied rebuke, but she said nothing more, merely nodding and moving away. "What did she want?" Kyle asked, appearing at Ruby's side with a protective arm around her waist. "Just to remind me of where I came from," Ruby replied. "As if I could forget." Kyle's face darkened. "You should never have had to scrub floors until your hands bled." Ruby leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "If I hadn't, we might never have met, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." As summer turned to fall, the ranch prospered. The first harvest from their fields was abundant, and Kyle added another 20 head to their growing herd of cattle. Ruby's garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, and she began preserving the excess for winter, filling the root cellar with jars of tomatoes, green beans, and peaches. Their partnership was as strong in marriage as it had been in business. Kyle might be the sheriff in town, but at the ranch, decisions were made jointly. Ruby's practical nature complemented Kyle's vision, and together they built something neither could have achieved alone. One evening in early October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Kyle noticed Ruby seemed quieter than usual. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, taking her hand in his. Ruby smiled, a secret sort of smile that made his heart skip. "I was just thinking that we might need to add on to the house soon." "Oh," Kyle raised an eyebrow. "Planning to take in boarders?" Ruby laughed softly. "Not exactly." She took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to need a nursery." For a moment Kyle stared at her in shock, then his face split in a grin of pure joy. "A baby, we're having a baby," Ruby nodded, her eyes shining. "In the spring. Are you happy?" In answer, Kyle pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke more eloquently than words. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he murmured against her lips. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted, Ruby Jackson. A home, a future, and now a family." Ruby nestled against him, contentment washing over her like a warm tide. From scrubbing floors with raw, bleeding hands to this moment of perfect happiness, it had been a journey she could never have imagined. "Not bad for a servant girl," she said with a smile, echoing Madame Holloway's dismissive words from years ago. Kyle tilted her chin up, his eyes serious. "You were never just a servant girl, Ruby. You were always meant for more, for partnership, for love, for this life we're building together." As the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Ruby looked out over their land, the fields they had planted, the cattle grazing in the distance, the home they had rebuilt together. From the lowest point in her life had come this greatest blessing, not just love but respect, partnership, and a future bright with promise. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when you first saw me at the boarding house, my hands were raw from scrubbing floors all day. And now they're strong from building a life," Kyle finished, raising her hands to his lips and gently kissing the calluses that spoke of honest work and determined spirit. "I may have hired you as my equal partner, Ruby, but you've become so much more." "We both have," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "And this is only the beginning." The winter of 1875-1876 was a harsh one in the Fort Yuma area. Snow was rare, but bitter winds swept down from the mountains, and freezing rain turned the ranch into a muddy, icy challenge. Kyle and Ruby faced it together, rising before dawn to break ice in the water troughs and ensure the cattle had feed. Despite the difficulties, they found joy in the season. They decorated their home with pine boughs and candles for Christmas, exchanged simple gifts, and hosted a feast for their ranch hands. At night, they would sit by the fire, Kyle reading aloud from one of his books while Ruby worked on tiny garments for their coming child. "Do you think it will be a boy or a girl?" Kyle asked one evening, his hand resting on Ruby's growing belly. Ruby smiled, feeling the baby kick against his palm. "I don't care as long as he or she is healthy." "What do you want?" Kyle considered for a moment. "A little girl with your spirit and determination," he decided. "Or a boy with your compassion and intelligence. Either way, I win." Ruby laughed, leaning over to kiss him. "That's a diplomatic answer, Sheriff Jackson." "It's an honest one, Mrs. Jackson," he replied, his eyes warm with love. As winter gave way to spring, the ranch burst into new life. Calves were born, fields turned green, and Ruby's garden began to yield early vegetables. Her pregnancy progressed well, though she found herself tiring more easily and having to delegate some of her usual tasks to Kyle or the ranch hands. "You're not taking enough rest," Kyle fretted one afternoon when he found her hauling water to her garden. Ruby set down the bucket with a sigh. "I can't just sit and do nothing for months, Kyle. I'll go mad with boredom." "There's a difference between doing nothing and doing everything," he pointed out reasonably. "Let me help more. That's what partners do." Ruby relented, allowing Kyle to take over some of her heavier chores while she focused on preparing for the baby. Together, they converted one of the smaller rooms in the house into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and setting up a cradle that Kyle had made himself. The baby arrived on a perfect May morning, with sunshine streaming through the windows and meadowlarks singing in the fields. The labor was long and difficult, but Ruby faced it with the same quiet courage she had shown in all the challenges of her life. Kyle paced outside the bedroom door, pale with worry as the midwife and her assistant worked inside. When at last the cry of a newborn pierced the air, he nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife emerged, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling. "You have a fine son, Sheriff Jackson, and your wife is asking for you." Kyle entered the bedroom on unsteady legs. Ruby lay propped against pillows, her face radiant with exhaustion and joy as she cradled a small bundle wrapped in a white blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Kyle approached the bed as if in a dream, perching carefully on the edge and peering at the tiny red face nestled against Ruby's breast. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he blinked up at his father, Kyle's blue eyes. "He's perfect," Kyle whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. 5 perfect fingers curled reflexively around his one, and Kyle felt his heart expand with a love so powerful it left him breathless. "What shall we name him?" Ruby smiled up at her husband. "I thought perhaps Thomas, after your father." Kyle's eyes filled with unexpected tears. His father had died just before he came west, their relationship mended but still bearing the scars of old disagreements. "Thomas," he repeated, tasting the name. "Thomas James Jackson." "James for my father," Ruby agreed, her own eyes bright with emotion. "A good name for a good man." Kyle leaned down to kiss her, then pressed his lips to his son's forehead. "Thank you," he murmured, "for everything." News of young Thomas's birth spread quickly through Fort Yuma and the surrounding ranches. Visitors came bearing gifts, hand-knitted blankets, preserved fruits, and small wooden toys. Even Madame Holloway sent a silver cup with the baby's initials engraved on it, a peace offering of sorts that Ruby graciously acknowledged. As spring turned to summer, Kyle resumed some of his duties as sheriff, though he arranged his schedule to be at the ranch as much as possible. Ruby recovered her strength quickly, managing the household with baby Thomas either in a sling across her chest or napping in his cradle nearby. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, now a cherished daily ritual, Kyle turned to Ruby with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about giving up the sheriff's badge," he said quietly. Ruby looked at him in surprise. "But you love being sheriff. You're good at it." "I love you and Thomas more," Kyle replied simply. "And I'm good at ranching too. The territory has offered me the position permanently with a raise in pay, but it would mean more time away from home, more danger." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses that had replaced the raw wounds of their first meeting. "I don't want to miss watching our son grow up. I don't want you to worry every time I ride out if I'll come back." Ruby considered his words carefully. Their partnership had always been built on honesty and respect for each other's choices. "What would you do instead?" "Focus solely on the ranch," Kyle nodded. "The cattle operation is doing well, and I've been thinking about expanding into horses. There's good money in breeding and training quality stock for the Army and for stagecoach lines." "You'd be good at that," Ruby agreed, imagining Kyle working with horses, something she knew he loved. "But I don't want you to give up being sheriff because you think that's what I want." "This has to be your decision," Kyle smiled, raising her hand to his lips. "That's why I love you, Ruby Jackson, always thinking of me even when I'm thinking of you." His expression grew serious again. "It is my decision. I took the badge because I believed in justice and wanted to make a difference. But now I see I can make a difference right here, raising our son to be a good man, building something that will last beyond my lifetime, loving you every day for the rest of our lives." Ruby leaned over to kiss him, her heart full. "Then I support your decision, partner, whatever you choose to do." The next day, Kyle rode into Fort Yuma and turned in his badge. There was genuine regret among the townspeople, who had come to respect their fair-minded sheriff, but also understanding. A man with a young family had different priorities. With his new freedom, Kyle threw himself into expanding the ranch operations. He purchased a small herd of quality mares and 2 stallions with impressive bloodlines, beginning the horse breeding program he had envisioned. Ruby continued to manage the household and garden, now with Thomas toddling after her on sturdy legs, babbling happily as she taught him the names of plants and animals. Their partnership, forged in those early days when her hands were raw from scrubbing floors, and he had seen in her the strength that others missed, only grew stronger. Each brought different strengths to their marriage and their business. Each valued the other's contribution, and together they built a life that neither could have imagined alone. By the fall of 1877, the Jackson Ranch was known throughout the territory for its quality cattle and, increasingly, for its fine horses. Kyle's reputation as a fair dealer and expert horseman spread, bringing buyers from as far away as San Francisco and Denver. Ruby, now expecting their second child, had become a respected figure in the Fort Yuma community as well. She helped organize a small school for the children of neighboring ranchers, contributed to the new church building fund, and occasionally served as a midwife's assistant for difficult births. Not bad for a couple who started with nothing but a run-down ranch and a lot of determination, Kyle remarked one evening as they looked over the accounts for the month, a task they still performed together, sitting at the kitchen table after Thomas was asleep. Ruby smiled, thinking of how far they had come. "We had more than that," she said softly. "We had each other." Kyle reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb caressing the palm that had once been raw from scrubbing floors and was now strong from building a life. And that made all the difference. In December of that year, their daughter arrived, Catherine Ruby Jackson, named for Kyle's mother and her own. With Thomas now a boisterous 2-year-old, and baby Catherine demanding her share of attention, the house was filled with noise and laughter and occasional chaos. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Ruby confessed to Kyle one night as they stood in the doorway of the children's room, watching them sleep. Thomas sprawled across his small bed, Catherine nestled in her cradle. Kyle slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. "You deserve every happiness, Ruby. You've worked hard for it." She leaned into him, grateful for his strength, his love, his unwavering belief in her. "We both have, and we've built something wonderful together." As they turned from the doorway, walking hand in hand back to their own room, Ruby thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. From scrubbing floors with bleeding hands to managing a thriving ranch, from loneliness to love, from despair to hope, it hadn't always been easy. There had been hardships, drought years when the crops failed, a barn fire that had destroyed a season's hay, illnesses that had swept through the cattle herd. But through it all, they had faced each challenge together, equal partners in adversity as well as success. And now, as they prepared to welcome a new year and all the promise it held, Ruby knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever the future brought, they would meet it the same way, side by side, hand in hand, hearts beating as one. The cowboy who had once hired her as his equal partner had become so much more her husband, the father of her children, her best friend, her truest love. And she, who had once been nothing more than a maid with raw, bleeding hands, had become his equal in every way, strong, capable, respected, and above all, loved. It was, Ruby thought as she closed the bedroom door behind them, the most perfect happy ending to a story she had never dared to imagine for herself. And yet, it wasn't an ending at all, but a continuation, another chapter in the life they were writing together, one day at a time, with courage, determination, and abiding love.